They say that on the 4th of July, the road up Cherry Mountain was choked with a pilgrimage of the thirsty and the defiant. Thousands of people, judges and outlaws, preachers and laborers, climbed that steep North Carolina slope, drawn by a single promise. At the summit, a stout, smiling man named Amos Owens stood beside barrels of a legendary ruby-red liqueur, ladling it out for free to all who came. He was a moonshiner, a tax evader, an enemy of the federal government. But on that mountain, he was a king. How does a man become a legend in his own lifetime? How does a common criminal earn the loyalty of an entire region, turning his defiance into a roaring celebration that the law itself was powerless to stop? Was he a simple man breaking the law for profit? Or was he the last bastion of a fiercely independent mountain spirit? Today, we're going to pour a glass of history and trace the life of the one and only Cherry Bounce King, to understand the man who built a kingdom from corn, wild cherries, and an unbreakable will. To understand a man like Amos Owens, you have to understand the ground he was raised on. He was born in 1822 in Rutherford County, North Carolina, a place where the Blue Ridge Mountains begin to claw their way toward the sky. This wasn't just a landscape, it was a fortress. The people who settled these hollows were mostly Scotch-Irish, folks who carried a deep and abiding distrust of distant governments in their bones. They had fled kings and landlords once, and they weren't about to bow to a tax collector from Washington, D.C. Life here was a constant struggle against rock, weather, and isolation. A family's wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the yield of their corn patch, the health of their livestock, and the strength of their kin. Corn was life, but it was heavy and difficult to transport over rugged mountain trails. Turning that corn into whiskey was simple economics. It was a way to concentrate a year's worth of hard labor into a portable, profitable, and potent form. For these mountain families, the smoke from a copper still wasn't the sign of a crime. It was the smell of survival. This world operated on a code older than any federal law. Your word was your bond. Your family was your nation. An insult to your honor had to be answered, and a neighbor in need was to be helped without question. The law was something that existed down in the flatlands, an alien system that didn't understand the realities of mountain life. The stories of the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s weren't taught as a failed uprising. They were passed down as tales of righteous defiance, cementing the belief that a man had a God-given right to his own craft. But Amos wasn't just a product of the mountains. He was forged in the fires of a foreign war. As a young man, he left his secluded home to fight in the Mexican-American War. Imagine that transition, from the quiet, green solitude of Appalachia to the dusty, brutal battlefields of a foreign land. This experience hardened him. It taught him discipline. It showed him a world far beyond his mountain, and it likely reinforced his belief in self-reliance above all else. He was a veteran, a man who had served his country. When Amos Owens returned home, he came back a different man. He had seen the authority of the United States government up close, but he chose to climb back up Cherry Mountain and live by the old code. He didn't see a contradiction in having fought for the flag and then defying its laws. In his mind, the government had its place, and that place was not on his mountain, telling him what he could and could not do with the corn he grew with his own 2 hands. This was the crucible that created the Cherry Bounce King. He was a man of his people, steeped in a tradition of defiance. He was a farmer who understood the brutal math of survival. And he was a soldier who had learned how to stand his ground. The mountain gave him his ingredients and his fortress, but his unbending character, that was forged in the history of his ancestors and the heat of war. Long before the name Cherry Bounce King echoed through the halls of government, there was just Amos Owens, the artisan. Before the roaring crowds and the legendary defiance, there was the quiet solitude of the pre-dawn hours, the gentle hiss of the copper still, and the steady hand of a man who was a master of his craft. He wasn't just brewing moonshine, he was practicing an art form passed down through generations. He knew the corn by its feel, the fire by its sound, and the final product by a single practiced taste. His cherry bounce wasn't just potent, it was perfect, a testament to a pride in his work that no federal law could ever touch. But this craft wasn't for his own glory. It was the foundation of his family. The income from his hidden stills meant his wife had what she needed and his children never went to bed hungry. It meant he could afford good tools for his farm and solid shoes for their feet. His operation allowed him to build a life on that rugged mountain that was a step above mere survival. He was a patriarch in the truest mountain sense, the unwavering provider and protector of his clan. The world he built was one of security and stability, a small, independent nation with his homestead at its capital. And his influence spread beyond his own fence line. On Cherry Mountain and in the hollows below, Amos Owens was a pillar of the community. In a place where cash was as rare as a flat piece of land, he was the local economy's heartbeat. He bought his neighbors surplus corn at a fair price, providing them with the hard currency they needed. When a family fell on hard times, it was often Amos they turned to for a loan or assistance, a request he rarely refused. He commanded a deep, unshakable respect, not because of fear, but because his success was shared with those around him. This was the kingdom Amos Owens built, long before the outside world took notice. It was a world governed by loyalty, sustained by his craft, and centered on his family and community. It was a life of quiet dignity and fierce independence, a peaceful defiance conducted not with guns, but with copper pots and wild cherries. This was everything he stood to lose. It wasn't just a business the revenuers were threatening. It was his home, his honor, and the entire world he held dear. Every great man has a current running through him, a force that drives his every decision. For Amos Owens, that force was a stubborn pride as unyielding as mountain granite. It was a conviction buried deep in his soul that no man born in a distant city had the right to tell him what he could do on his own land. This wasn't just a belief, it was the very bedrock of his identity. He didn't just break the law, he disdained it. He saw the federal tax on liquor not as a legal statute, but as an intolerable insult to his craft and his heritage. This pride wasn't a quiet, internal thing. It was loud, bold, and defiant. While other moonshiners operated in the shadows, speaking in whispers and moving by moonlight, Amos Owens built a lighthouse. His legendary 4th of July and Christmas celebrations, where he gave away his cherry bounce by the barrelful, were the ultimate expression of this flaw. These weren't just parties, they were public declarations. He was telling the world, and specifically the federal government, I am here. This is my craft, and I am not ashamed of it. Come and get me if you dare. There's a story, told and retold until it's become gospel in those parts, that perfectly captures this audacious spirit. After one of his many arrests, Amos was brought before a judge who, tired of their game, levied a particularly steep fine against him. The courtroom fell silent, expecting the old moonshiner to protest or ask for time to pay. Instead, Amos simply nodded, reached deep into the pocket of his overalls, and pulled out a thick wad of cash, bills still smelling faintly of corn mash and wood smoke. He counted out the full amount, placed it on the bench without a word, and walked out a free man. It was not an act of submission, it was an act of mockery. He was using the profits of his crime to pay the penalty, reducing the judge's sentence to a mere business expense. This pride, this absolute refusal to bend, was his greatest strength in the eyes of his neighbors. It's what made him a folk hero. But it was also the crack in his armor. It made him visible. It made him a target. A lesser man might have laid low after a raid, moved his still, and sold his product quietly. But Amos' pride wouldn't allow that. He would rebuild, bigger and better, and the smoke would rise from his chimney stack on Cherry Mountain like a defiant flag, a signal to the law that he had not been beaten. His flaw, then, was his inability to compromise his own code. He was a king on his mountain, and kings do not bow. This stubborn streak ensured that his conflict with the government would never be a quiet, hidden affair. It was destined to become a public spectacle, a long and drawn-out war of attrition. He was daring the lightning to strike, forgetting that in the world of federal law, the storm always gathers eventually. For years, the dance between Amos Owens and the law had a familiar, almost comfortable rhythm. A federal marshal, often a local man who understood the mountain ways, would make the reluctant journey up Cherry Mountain. Stills would be broken, a warrant would be served, and Amos would go along peacefully. It was a ritual, a game of appearances, where the law made its point, and Amos paid his tax in the form of a fine. He always rebuilt, and the marshals always knew he would. There was a strange, unspoken understanding in this ongoing feud. But after the Civil War, the music changed. The federal government was nearly bankrupt, and its thirst for tax revenue became insatiable. The Bureau of Internal Revenue was empowered, unleashing a new breed of agent upon the mountains. These weren't local men playing a part. They were strangers with cold eyes and a fervent belief in federal authority. They saw the mountains not as a different world with its own rules, but as a den of tax cheats who were robbing the US Treasury. Their mission wasn't to play a game, it was to win a war. The spark that lit the fuse came on a crisp autumn morning. A team of these new, determined revenuers stormed Cherry Mountain. This raid was different. It wasn't just about the equipment. With grim efficiency, they found Amos's aging cellar, a cool space dug into the mountainside where his finished product, his art, was stored. They didn't confiscate it. With axes and sledgehammers, they systematically smashed every jug and barrel. Years of work, hundreds of gallons of his legendary cherry bounce, gushed out and stained the earth a deep, bloody red. They were destroying his legacy, pouring his very soul into the dirt. Amos Owens, who had always met his arrest with a wry smile, stood and watched this sacrilege in cold silence. This was no longer a matter of business. They hadn't just destroyed his property, they had committed an act of profound disrespect. They had vandalized his art, violated the sanctity of his craft, and declared that his life's work was nothing more than contraband to be annihilated. The unspoken rules of their long dance had been shattered. For Amos, this was a declaration of war. This act was an unforgivable affront precisely because it struck at the heart of his defiant pride. To be arrested was one thing. To be treated as a common criminal whose masterpiece deserved no more respect than ditch water was another. They had challenged his status, his honor, and his identity as the king of his own mountain. In that moment, watching his life's work bleed into the ground, a decision was made. He would no longer be a mere moonshiner who got caught now and then. He would become a symbol. His operation would grow larger, his celebrations more brazen, and his name would become a banner of defiance for the entire region to rally behind. The red stain on the ground where his cherry bounce had been spilled was a line drawn in the dirt. Amos Owens' response wasn't fear, it was fury. He did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, he did the opposite. The smoke from Cherry Mountain, which had always been a steady wisp, now billowed into a column. He built new stills, bigger and more efficient. He hired more men. He doubled his production. He was no longer just supplying a thirsty region. He was building an empire in open defiance of the United States government. The warnings started as quiet whispers. His own wife, who had stood by him through dozens of arrests, saw the new hardness in the eyes of the federal men who rode through the nearby towns. She would plead with him at night, by the firelight, her voice full of a fear he'd never heard before. "Amos," she would say, "this is different now. It's not a game anymore. They don't just want a fine. They want to see you broken." He would listen, pat her hand, and tell her that a man who bows to a bully invites him to kick again. The whispers grew louder in the community. Friends who had celebrated his audacity now pulled him aside with worried looks. They spoke of revenuers threatening local farmers for information, of a new, ruthless pressure being applied to the entire area. Just lay low for a while, Amos, they'd advise. Let the heat die down. Make your run, but do it quiet-like. They were counseling survival, the ancient mountain art of bending like a sapling in a storm so as not to break. But Amos Owens was no sapling. He was a great old oak, and he would not bend. He saw their pleas for caution as a step towards surrender. To him, this was no longer about a single man's still. It was about the soul of the mountains. He told them that if he backed down, the federal men would come for them next. He preached his gospel of defiance, arguing that the only way to meet a threat is to stand taller and look it square in the eye. His pride had now transformed into a righteous cause. The ultimate act of defiance was his next 4th of July celebration. Where others saw a reason for caution, Amos saw a stage. He sent out word. The party on Cherry Mountain would be bigger than ever before. It became a public spectacle, an open challenge broadcast across the state. He wasn't just inviting his friends and customers. He was taunting the Bureau of Internal Revenue. He was turning his defiance into a beacon, daring them to try and extinguish it in front of thousands of his supporters. With every warning he ignored, every plea for moderation he dismissed, the path forward narrowed until there was only one way it could go. He had become a symbol, a living embodiment of the mountain spirit, and the government could not allow such a symbol to stand. He was isolating himself on a peak of his own making, a king so confident in his fortress that he could no longer see the army gathering at its gates. A violent outcome was no longer a risk. It was a certainty he himself was inviting. The day before the 4th of July dawned clear and bright over Cherry Mountain. The air was already electric with anticipation. Wagons were being moved into place. Barrels of cherry bounce were rolled out from the cellar, and the sound of hammers echoed as a stage was built for the fiddlers. This was to be Amos Owens' masterpiece of defiance, the grandest celebration he had ever hosted. But as the sun reached its zenith, a lone rider was seen making his way steadily up the mountain path. It wasn't a posse. It was the familiar, weary face of an old federal marshal, a man who had arrested Amos more than once in the bygone days of their gentleman's feud. He didn't come with warrants or weapons. He dismounted, met Amos near the Great Log Hall, and spoke not as a lawman, but as one man to another. He explained that the world had changed. The new men in charge in Raleigh and Washington saw Amos not as a local character, but as the leader of an insurrection. They were coming, he warned, not for a token arrest, but to crush him completely. "They're just waiting for this party, Amos," the marshal said, his voice low. "They'll use the crowd as an excuse. They'll say it was a riot. Men are going to get hurt." Then came the final, clear off-ramp, the last chance for peace. "Cancel it," the marshal pleaded, "just for this year. Send everyone home. Show them you're not looking for a fight. If you do this, I can go back and tell them the threat is over. We can go back to the way things were. It's your last chance to put the genie back in the bottle." It was a surprisingly fair offer. It was a path away from the cliff's edge. All he had to do was swallow his pride. For a long moment, Amos Owens was silent. You can just imagine him, standing there on his mountain, the smell of his life's work all around him. He likely looked at his home, at the preparations for the festival, at the faces of his kin. He had to have felt the weight of the choice before him, the safety of his family versus the defiant code that had defined his entire life. The marshal's offer was reasonable. It was wise. But to Amos, it sounded like the clatter of chains. He finally turned his gaze from his home and met the marshal's eyes. The internal struggle was over. "A man doesn't send his guests home," Amos said, his voice as firm as the mountain beneath his feet, "just because an uninvited stranger is threatening to kick down the door. The party goes on." With that, the last bridge to peace was burned. He had been offered a truce and had chosen war. The old marshal simply nodded, a look of profound sadness on his face, and rode away, leaving the cherry-bounce king alone on his throne, waiting for the inevitable storm he had personally summoned. The 4th of July on Cherry Mountain was a roaring sea of humanity. The fiddles screamed, the banjos rang, and the rhythmic stomp of dancing feet shook the very ground. Above it all was the booming laughter of Amos Owens, a king in his element, ladling out his ruby-red elixir. But as the afternoon sun began to dip, a different sound drifted up from the base of the mountain, the cold, rhythmic clink of metal and the steady tramp of marching feet. A long column of federal agents and deputized men, armed and determined, was ascending the slope. The music faltered, then died. A wave of silence rolled through the crowd as all eyes turned to the approaching force. The world for Amos Owens narrowed to the sight of those grim-faced men, their polished badges glinting in the sun. This wasn't a raid. It was an invasion. He stood his ground behind his barrels, not with a weapon in his hand, but with the full weight of his defiance in his posture. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the energy of 1,000 held breaths. A federal captain stepped forward, a warrant held out like a weapon, and his voice cut through the stillness, demanding surrender. Amos' reply was not a shout, but a low, firm refusal that was heard by every person on that mountaintop. And in that instant, the simmering tension that had built for years finally boiled over. The captain gave a signal, and the line of lawmen surged forward. The crowd, loyal and fueled by Cherry Bounce, pushed back. What happened next wasn't a battle of neat lines and clear commands. It was a chaotic, swirling vortex of human bodies. The world became a blur of motion and a cacophony of shouts. From Amos' perspective, it must have been a maelstrom. The celebration he had built, a symbol of his independence, had become a scene of pandemonium. An argument that had raged for a decade in courtrooms and whispers was suddenly, violently being settled with fists and clubs. The sharp, percussive sound of an intervention echoed through the holler, a sound that cut through the noise and hung in the air like a final, dreadful punctuation mark. In the heart of the chaos, Amos himself was the primary target. He was swarmed, not as a respected elder, but as the ringleader of a mob. He felt the grasp of rough hands, the impact of a world turned hostile. The final, visceral sensation was not one of his choosing. The vibrant festival, the pinnacle of his lifelong defiance, was over. The argument that had defined his life had been answered not with words, but with overwhelming force. The chilling silence that followed the main event was broken only by the groans of the injured and the curt, metallic orders of the federal agents who were now, finally, masters of the mountain. The world came back into focus slowly for Amos Owens, through a haze of shock and the dull ache of struggle. The roar of the crowd had been replaced by a grim quiet, punctuated by the sharp orders of federal officers. His great hall, a place of joyous celebration just an hour before, was a scene of wreckage. Overturned benches, smashed jugs, and the dark, sticky pools of spilled cherry bounce littered the ground. He wasn't a king surveying his court. He was a prisoner standing in the ruins of his own kingdom. There was no regret in his heart. There was no fear. There was only a cold, profound rage that settled deep in his bones. This was the ultimate violation. To be manhandled, overpowered, and subdued on his own land, in front of his own people, it was a humiliation worse than any fine or prison sentence. The final insult came with a sharp, metallic click. The cold iron of the handcuffs closing around his wrists was a sound louder and more final than any gunshot. On the very spot where he had freely dispensed his hospitality, his freedom was now completely and utterly taken away. His next move was not his own. Flanked by armed guards, he began the long walk down the mountain. This was the path he had climbed as a boy and ruled as a king, a path every stone of which he knew by heart. Now, he walked it in chains. He passed his home, catching a glimpse of his wife's face, pale and stricken, in the doorway. He passed neighbors who looked on with a mixture of pity and awe. He did not lower his head. Pride was the one thing they could not take from him, and he carried it like a shield, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. At the base of the mountain, a government wagon waited. As he was loaded into the back, he took one last look at his domain. The sun was setting behind Cherry Mountain, casting long shadows across the hollows. The crowds were gone. The music was gone. The smoke from his stills was extinguished. The king was being exiled from his kingdom. As the wagon lurched forward and began the journey toward a federal jail, Amos Owens knew this was the end of the road. His active defiance was over. All that remained were the consequences. The fall of a king is never a quiet thing, and the silence that fell over Cherry Mountain was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The wreckage left behind wasn't just in the smashed stills and splintered barrels. It was in the lives of every person Amos Owens had touched. For his wife and children, the world had been turned upside down. The provider was gone, the income had vanished, and the home that was once a fortress of local pride was now a landmark of federal victory. The name Owens, once spoken with respect, now became a brand, a name whispered in conjunction with violence, arrest, and ruin. They were left to face the cold stares of the law and the uncertain pity of their neighbors, all while trying to scratch a living from a mountain that now seemed haunted by loss. The community itself bore a deep and festering wound. Many who had attended the celebration were arrested or injured in the chaos. Families were thrown into turmoil, trying to pay fines or tend to the wounded. The raid had been a brutal lesson from the government. This is what happens when you follow a rebel. The fierce unity that Amos had commanded was shattered and replaced by a gnawing fear. Who would be next? The raid had driven a wedge of distrust into the heart of the mountain, turning a proud and defiant community into a collection of frightened individuals, wary of their neighbors and terrified of the law. The economic engine Amos had built sputtered and died. The farmers who had relied on him to buy their surplus corn were left with a product they couldn't easily sell. The men who had worked his stills were suddenly without employment, their families facing a hard winter with no income. The flow of cash that had trickled down from Cherry Mountain, oiling the gears of the local economy, dried up completely. His defiance had brought prosperity, but his fall brought a poverty that was just as widespread. He had been the trunk of a great tree, and the federal axe had not just felled him, but had left the entire forest around him to wither. The tragedy of Amos Owens was not that he was arrested. It was that his personal war had so many civilian casualties. His pride demanded a grand public stand, but it was his family, his friends, and his neighbors who were left to pay the price for it. He had built a kingdom and invited his people to celebrate within its walls, never imagining that when the walls came crashing down, they would be the ones crushed beneath the stones. The party was over, but the hangover would last for a generation. Amos Owens, the king of Cherry Mountain, was brought to a kingdom where he held no power, a federal courtroom. The space itself was an assault on everything he knew. The air was stale, the light was filtered through dusty windows, and the walls were made of cold plaster and dark polished wood, a world away from the open sky and living timber of his home. Here, he was not a respected elder or a master craftsman. He was simply the defendant, a name stripped of all honor and history. The prosecution, methodical and relentless, painted a picture not of a folk hero, but of a calculated criminal. They spoke of tax evasion, conspiracy, and most damningly, of inciting a riot and assaulting federal officers in the execution of their duties. They presented evidence, the shattered remnants of his stills, the testimony of injured agents, and the sheer scale of his operation. To the court, the case was simple. Here was a man who had grown wealthy by openly flouting the laws of the United States and had met the consequences with violence. His defense, when it came, was not a denial, but a declaration. Amos and his lawyer didn't argue the facts. They argued a whole different kind of truth. They spoke of a man's right to his own land and the fruits of his own labor. They spoke of a tradition older than the federal government itself. When asked to account for his actions, Amos' logic was baffling to the court and perfectly clear to his people. It was his corn. It was his mountain. It was his craft. He wasn't breaking the law. He was living by a different one, a code of self-sufficiency and honor that the men in their starched collars could never comprehend. It was a clash of two Americas in a single room. Back in the mountains, the trial was seen as a foregone conclusion, a piece of political theater. They saw Amos not as a criminal, but as a martyr. He was their champion, captured and put on display by an invading army that called itself the law. His guilt was irrelevant to them. His cause was everything. They knew the court would never understand that the real crime in their eyes had been the government's intrusion, the desecration of his craft, and the violent end to a peaceful celebration. The verdict, when it came, was swift and certain. In the eyes of federal law, there was no ambiguity. Amos Owens was guilty on all counts. The judge, determined to make an example of the so-called Cherry Bounce King, delivered a sentence meant to echo through every hidden hollow in Appalachia. A long, sobering term in a federal penitentiary. And so, the law had its judgment. A man who broke the statutes was punished according to the letter of those statutes. But was it justice? For the people of Cherry Mountain, the answer was a bitter no. A system that could not distinguish between a craftsman and a criminal, that could not understand the difference between profit and survival, was not a system of justice. It was just a system of power. The gavel had fallen, but the verdict only deepened the divide between the mountains and the flatlands, leaving a scar of resentment that would not heal for a very long time. And what of the men who brought the king down? What of the federal agents, the new breed of lawmen who had turned a gentleman's game into a brutal war? You might expect a story like this to end with them meeting some form of mountain justice, a karmic balancing of the scales. But the world, especially the world of government and law, rarely works like a folk ballad. The men who led the raid on Cherry Mountain didn't face consequences. They received commendations. From their perspective, and from the perspective of their superiors in Washington, the operation was a resounding success. They had targeted the most famous, most defiant moonshiner in the state, and had dismantled his empire in a single afternoon. They had enforced federal law, quelled a riot, and sent a clear, unambiguous message to every distiller operating in the shadows. In their reports, Amos Owens was a criminal mastermind, and they were the brave heroes who had restored order. They were rewarded with promotions, with praise, and with the satisfaction of a job well done. They were gears in a vast, impersonal machine, and that machine had just proven its power. Their victory, however, was a sterile one. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had salted the earth of the battlefield. They didn't end moonshining in the mountains, they just made it quieter, more secretive, and more deeply entangled with a culture of resentment. They had created a martyr. For every large public still they smashed, a dozen smaller hidden ones were built in its place, their operators now working with a grim determination born of hatred for the law. The government had proven it could crush one man, but it had also proven that it had no understanding of the people it was trying to govern. The fate of the antagonist, the system, was to grow larger and more powerful, yet more alienated than ever from the heart of the nation it claimed to serve. And that, in its own way, is a kind of failure that no commendation can erase. Years passed, as they do in the mountains, smoothing the sharp edges of memory like water over stone. Amos Owens eventually walked out of the federal penitentiary, a free man, but no longer a king. He was an old man now, the fire that had once burned so brightly banked to a low, quiet coal. He returned to Cherry Mountain, but the kingdom was gone. He lived out the rest of his days quietly, a living ghost of his former self, surrounded by the silence of a legacy that was too grand and too painful to speak of aloud. The name Owens became a kind of mountain ghost itself, a name that carried the weight of both glory and ruin. His descendants were left to navigate a world that saw them as the children of a legend, and legends cast long, cold shadows. Some moved away, hoping to build lives free from the constant echo of their famous ancestors' rise and fall. Those who stayed lived quieter lives, becoming farmers and laborers, their hands in the soil instead of in the corn mash. The grand dynasty of the Cherry Bounce King ended with him. The recipe was lost to time, and the art died with the artisan. The community healed, but like any deep wound, it left a permanent scar. The great roaring celebrations on Cherry Mountain were never spoken of loudly again. They passed into the realm of myth, a story old men would tell their grandsons with a sad shake of their heads, a cautionary tale about a time when giants walked the earth and were struck down by lightning from a distant government. The open, proud defiance that Amos had championed was buried under a heavy blanket of silence. Moonshining continued, of course, but it was driven deeper into the darkest hollows, a grim business of survival, not a craft of celebration. In the vacuum left by Amos' fall, the power dynamics of the region shifted. With the king deposed, the kingdom fractured. The era of the grand festive moonshiner was over. It was replaced by a new generation who worked in fear and dealt in violence. Men who didn't command the respect of their community and saw the law not as a rival, but as an enemy to be met with deadly force. The government, in its attempt to stamp out a folk hero, had inadvertently created a landscape ripe for common criminals. They had traded a charismatic king for 100 petty warlords, and the mountains became a more dangerous, less honorable place because of it. If you go to Rutherford County today and mention the name Amos Owens, you won't be met with a blank stare. His name is as much a part of the landscape as Cherry Mountain itself, the peak that still bears his story. You can visit his final resting place, a weathered tombstone that states the simple facts of his birth and death, but tells nothing of the fire that burned in between. Some old-timers claim that if you know just where to look, deep in the woods on the mountain slope, you can find the faint outline of a foundation, the scattered stones that were once the hearth of a king. But what people really search for on that mountain isn't stone, it's treasure. The most enduring myth of Amos Owens is that he never trusted banks. The considerable profits from his 60-year career, the story goes, were packed into mason jars and iron pots and buried in secret caches all over the mountain. To this day, the legend of the Cherry Bounce King's fortune persists. Treasure hunters, armed with metal detectors and old maps, still comb those slopes, digging in the red clay, hoping to unearth a piece of the outlaw's legacy. More enduring than any buried treasure, though, are the stories. In the telling, the hard edges of the man have been worn smooth by time. He is remembered not as the tax evader who sparked a riot, but as the generous king who held a feast for his people. He's become a Robin Hood of the Blue Ridge, a symbol of defiance against an unjust system. His story is told as a cautionary tale to children about the dangers of pride, but it's told with a wink and a smile, a clear undercurrent of admiration for the man who dared to stand his ground. And that is why his ghost still walks these mountains. It's not the spirit of a man, but the spirit of an idea. The name Amos Owens has become an echo of that old, unbending mountain code of independence. To speak his name is to speak of a time when a man could declare his own land a sovereign nation and rule it with generosity and an iron will. He is the physical embodiment of the stubborn, defiant, and fiercely loyal character that defines the very soul of Appalachia. Amos Owens. The man has been dust for over a century. But the spirit of the Cherry Bounce King, that spirit is as potent and intoxicating as the liqueur he once brewed. It's woven into the very fabric of those hills, a permanent reminder that some men are too big for the laws of their time. For better or for worse, he still haunts the mountains. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning, standing at the foot of that old mountain. Was Amos Owens a hero or a villain? The law has its simple answer. He was a criminal, a tax evader who paid the price for his crimes. His people have theirs. He was a king, a generous folk hero who stood up for their way of life. But the truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more human. Amos Owens wasn't a hero or a villain. He was a relic of a dying age, a man whose mountain code was being crushed by the relentless march of a modern nation. In the end, the Ballad of Amos Owens is a story about pride. It was a pride as pure and potent as the whiskey he distilled. It drove him to master his craft, to provide for his family, and to build a community around the fire of his generosity. But that same unbending pride made him blind. It blinded him to the changing world. It made him deaf to the warnings of those who loved him, and it demanded a sacrifice that was not his alone to make. His greatest strength, that absolute refusal to bow, became the fatal flaw that brought his entire kingdom crashing down into the dirt. He was a man who stood for the timeless values of independence, craftsmanship, and community. But he stood so tall that he became a target, and in his fall, he reminds us that even the strongest oak on the mountain can be felled by the patient axe of the outside world. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of the Cherry Bounce King, a man who would give away his finest liquor for free, but would not surrender a single drop of his pride to any law under heaven.